Welcome, Dr. Amedeo Giorgi, Professor Emeritus of Saybrook University and one of the founding members of the doctoral program in psychology at Duquesne University. Thanks for joining us at the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology and for doing this interview.
My pleasure, yeah.
I'd like to start with the story of how you went from being an experimental psychologist to a phenomenologist.
Well, I went into psychology because I read William James. And what I liked about James was especially the chapter on consciousness. And so when I went to grad school, I was expecting to thematize my work on James, and nobody covered James. I went to an experimental program. It was very scientific, very naturalistic, and to learn, I read James completely on my own, but that was my own work or doing term papers for courses where I could include James. So I kind of went through graduate school with a certain gap, a certain lack. What I was looking for wasn't there. So I got trained as an experimentalist, and my dissertation was experimental. And I was pretty sure I was going to be an academic, but I thought I might try real-world experiences first. So there were openings in consulting firms. So I was hired by Dunlap and Associates of Stamford, Connecticut. And so I went there, and it was mostly applied experimental work. And so that was my first job, my first exposure, but it was still along experimental lines. And I was curious about sort of what happened to consciousness. So I started historical research, and of course I came across Franz Brentano, who in 1878, I think, wrote a book on empirical psychology, which thematized consciousness. So I found, oh, here's a psychologist who really thematized consciousness. And of course, Wundt had a book, 1878, the same year, advocating his experimental psychology, but still he defined psychology as the study of consciousness, or the science of consciousness. So he did it through introspection and experimentation, and I kept reading. Then I came across Dilthey, Wilhelm Dilthey, who was a more radical than Brentano, because he said we need a framework other than natural science to study consciousness, because consciousness is not naturalistic. So I was very much impressed by Dilthey, read him, wondered if I could, go think along his lines, when I came across Husserl. And I came across Husserl because one of my classmates at Fordham went to teach at Duquesne University. And one day I got a letter from him saying, there's a young Dutchman here who makes critiques about psychology the same as you did. You ought to meet him. So this friend, Ed Hogan, was my sounding board during my graduate. Every time I didn't like something, I would complain to him, and he would agree, of course, and nod and everything. Well, the person he referred to was Adrian van Kam. And Adrian van Kam was a Dutchman who emigrated from Holland and was going to become a U.S. citizen. And he had a master's degree in Europe, but he went for a doctorate to, I think it was Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And then he sort of told colleagues he was appalled at what passed for psychology in America, because in Europe, this is in the mid-50s, early 50s, phenomenology and existentialism had already hit. And Sartre had written, Merleau-Ponty had written, Ricard started to write. So all of that influence got into Holland, and it was already influencing psychology. So Van Kaam came to Duquesne, which had only a bachelor's program. So we said, let's start an MA, and Van Kaam was a priest that belonged to the order that owned Duquesne University. So we had an in. So we said, I'd like to start an MA program in religion and personality. So they gave him approval, and that started in the mid-50s, and phenomenology was introduced. Then he decided that let's start a doctoral program. Now in Pittsburgh there were 3 universities. Pitt was very animal-oriented, had a PhD program. Carnegie Mellon had a PhD program, but was sort of computer, technically oriented. So the question is, why should Duquesne introduce a PhD program since there were 2 already in the city? So Van Kaam argued to the administration, we're going to be phenomenological. That's a very different orientation and a different way of looking at psychology. So they gave him permission. So September 1962, the PhD program started, and that's when I joined Duquesne. So finally, then I came to Husserl. So I went Brentano to Dilthey to Husserl, and of course phenomenology is a philosophy of consciousness more than anything else. So with Husserl, we began to get articulations of many of the functions of consciousness that I thought could provide the basis for a psychology that would be based on phenomenological philosophy. So that's how I moved from experimental psych to phenomenological psychology, but always my intention was this was still mainstream research psychology. I was not moving to clinical or personality theory. The challenge that I was given was, can you come up with a method that is more sympathetic to our phenomenological approach than natural science methods? So that was my challenge right at the beginning. And of course I was only beginning to learn phenomenology. I was not trained in it. But I was lucky because at Duquesne, the philosophy department was phenomenological. And so what I did is every semester for 25 years, I sat in a philosophy course given by the philosophers on some aspect of phenomenology. Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Ricoeur, Schutz, Sartre, all of them. And so finally, after getting that broad exposure, I realized it was Husserl that I had to really understand well in order to found a phenomenological method for psychology. That's a brief synopsis.
So you mentioned that there were some things about experimental psychology that didn't quite sit right with you from the very beginning. So even before you were exposed to phenomenology, what were some of the problems or critiques you had of psychology as a natural science?
Well, of course, I was living in the era of behaviorism. And so what happened is consciousness was not even looked at. Behaviorism came in, or there was a kind of psychophysical parallelism. You studied the brain, and the assumption was whatever happens in the brain is what determines consciousness. Sort of dubious assumption, I would say, but nevertheless, that was an assumption. So what I picked up gradually, not right away, I had had a lot of exposure before I got the insight, I realized that consciousness was being displaced by behavior and brain. And if you read Watson, you'll see, I can't quote it verbatim, but the attitude was, all this introspective stuff that Titchener is doing, he says, I can't really stomach, I don't like it, why don't we really do like other sciences, study behavior because it was palpable. You could see the behavior, you could ignore consciousness and just make all your predictions based on behavior. So it was palpability and the fact that the behavior of the other was independent of the consciousness of the researcher. Then if you went to, physiological or neurological approaches, it was the same thing. You could record the activity of the brain. It was palpable. You put on a certain area of the brain, you got what was happening, and then you correlated that with experiential phenomena, whatever it was. So consciousness did creep in by default. They needed it, otherwise they didn't know what the brain was doing. So it was there as a secondary hypothesis, not as a primary one. So I realized that my motivation for coming into psychology was being ignored and displaced. And while I believe in the experimental method, insofar as you're studying physical phenomena, I have no problem with it. I affirm it, and I agree. But the application of that experimental method when there was no sensory givenness. So consciousness, as everyday world experience shows, does not present itself sensorially. How do I do that? You don't know how to do it. So my problem then was, how can the experimental method be successful with something that was not sensorially given? And of course, introspection tried to take the place of that, but then introspection was not independent of the subjectivity of the introspector. So he had no independent access. So some of the characteristics of consciousness, I thought, made it difficult to use the natural scientific method, because I had to come to the conclusion that consciousness was non-naturalistic. Therefore, we needed a non-naturalistic method. I didn't say that for a long time, but that was what was guiding a lot of my work. And with phenomenology, we could say, let me back up a minute. There are two traditions for research. One was the natural scientific tradition, where there was always sensorily given, and therefore you can manipulate and do all kinds of things. The other tradition was reflection. So since the time of the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, there was reflection. So psychology, in choosing to be a natural science, followed the tradition of experimentation. And with Husserl, he followed the tradition of reflection. But, we were trying to break away from philosophy. So we wanted to prove we were no longer philosophical. So we went to the experimental tradition. We can get labs and have all kinds of instruments that really made us look natural scientific. But I think we lost our authentic subject matter by trying to do that. So, again, I realized later on that we had to work within the reflective tradition, not the experimental tradition. So that was my another hesitation about using the experimental method for psychology. For physics, chemistry, absolutely. But for psychology, because the phenomena were non-naturalistic, there was no sensory givenness, and there was no independence of the subjectivity. So we had to think different strategies. Introspection was an empirical way of trying to answer that, and it led to problems. But when behaviorism came, everybody dropped introspection because behaviorism met the method much better. But the one step they all forgot is the data, the behavioristic data had to be present to the consciousness of the researcher. Otherwise, nothing got done. So you still could not eliminate consciousness, but you kind of put it to the ground so that it was no longer, foremost.
established method for doing research from this foundation. How'd you go about creating the phenomenological method?
Well, that's too is a long story. I'll try to shorten it. When I went there, Van Kam, coming from Holland, was aware there was what was called the Utrecht School of Phenomenology, and they were doing research. So he would say, there is a method. So I asked him, what is the method? He couldn't tell me. He was a personality theorist and more of a clinician, so he was not a researcher. Although when he did his dissertation, he did a qualitative research method, but compromised a bit with the quantitative tradition. So, okay, that's fair enough for the times. So I kept asking him, and he never gave me a complete answer. So I realized that I had to go to Europe. So my first sabbatical, when I had to be there 7 years, when I got the sabbatical, I went to Europe with the express purpose of discovering what the phenomenological method was. And what I did is I went to Copenhagen, because there was also a Copenhagen School of Phenomenology, and I had already met some of the Utrecht School people, Linschoten and Buitendijk, from earlier trips to Europe. So I had some sense of what they were doing, but I didn't know much about the Copenhagen School. So as I spoke with the people who were still there, Edgar Rubin, of Figure Ground fame, was the chair, but he had died before I got there. And so I had to talk to some of his colleagues. And what I realized is that they were working with another tradition of phenomenology, one that went back to Goethe, who was followed by a man named Purkinje, who was a visual psychologist. And then it was picked up by Hering, Hering, who was a researcher in a phenomenological tradition based upon Goethe's interpretation, not Husserl. So it was another way of looking at phenomenology. But when I asked the three colleagues, Ib Muskor, Franz Fromm, and Tranega Rasmussen, were the three colleagues of Rubin who were there, they really didn't know Husserl. They were aware of him, but they didn't operate within his tradition. So I explored all over Europe. I kept asking everybody I met, do you know anybody who's working with phenomenological work? And I got names, and I went to England and Germany, Belgium, France, Holland, and I met nobody who was using a phenomenological method. What I learned was phenomenological psychology meant a critique of mainstream psychology, but there was no constructive alternative. In other words, what if you already agree with phenomenology? How do you do research? How do you function? Nobody was speaking to that gap. So after surveying Europe and finding nobody, I got a little bit of courage. So when I came back to Duquesne, I started a seminar in, I think it was January 1970, called Phenomenological Psychology. I had about 8 students. I limited to 8. And I said, well, we're going to develop a method. And so we read Husserl, we began descriptively, and that's how the method started. So each year I taught the course, and of course I modified and developed. So without going through all the errors and mistakes, I'll come to the final. And I decided that, well, first of all, you have to describe. And what was important here was I started out with the talk, trying to introduce phenomenology. And I was given my own description of an experience. And an empiricist said, how do I know that your description of that experience is not unconsciously in the service of your theory? Now, you can answer that, of course, but what happened is I got so bogged down with that issue, I never got to the method. So I realized that, yeah, I want to work within the reflection tradition, but I have to get my data from others. And that's what science does. Philosophers can reflect and nobody objects. Whether you got Kant or Heidegger or Husserl, they reflect and come up with things, and that's okay. But in science, somehow, I think because of the strong empirical tradition, it's got to come from others. So I thought, well, okay, it'll come from others who don't know phenomenology, so they can't bring up that objection. So the first step then is I needed naive descriptions from others. Then came the question, how do you analyze that? And that, of course, can come from interviews or description. So then what I had in front of me was Husserl's method. Husserl did have a philosophical method. But if I followed it literally, I'd be doing philosophy, not psychology. So my question was, how can I be faithful to Husserl, but make it psychological rather than philosophical? So going to others was one step already. That would be more acceptable to scientists. Then I had to do two things that Husserl does. You bracket all knowledge about the phenomenon, so I can't pull in theories or even past findings. I don't let that influence how I approach it. And then within the reduction, and the reduction means I will take as given everything that is in consciousness, but only as it's given. So again, not only are all other theories and findings bracketed, but I really approach this in a way that all my results come up from the given data, nothing is imposed on it. So that's the reduction. So I thought, yeah, I can do that to a description. Okay. Then the next question was, okay, if it's science, how do you do that? And from my training as a psychophysicist, I thought, well, it has to be systematic and methodical. So when I got the description, I thought, well, in a certain sense, I have to be the critic's best friend. So he can't get inside my consciousness, so I have to communicate as best as I can what's going through my mind in order that he knows exactly what I did. So when I got a description, I would say, well, I have to break it up somehow into parts because I can't analyze the whole description. So I thought, well, what would be the criterion? For example, I could say, well, every sentence. But a sentence is a unit of grammar, not necessarily psychologically significant. So I'm saying, well, what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for the meaning of the experience. So I said, well, let me divide up according to meanings. So I said, I'll establish meaning units. I'll go through the whole text, and every time I experience a transition in meaning, I'll make a mark, and that becomes a meaning unit. And so at the end of that process, I have a series of meaning units, okay? Then the next step is, this description is in everyday language. I want to analyze it psychologically. So I have to give a psychological expression of an everyday event. And so I say, okay, the next step is, through the process of imaginative variation, which is a Husserlian method, you use that to come up with what is essential to the thing. So I'm looking for what is psychologically essential for the phenomenon I'm interested in, for the meaning unit I just read. And every answer is possible, from no significance to very powerful. And then you have to articulate the power that you see. So the next step is you transform all the everyday meaning units into psychological expressions, okay? And you go through all the meaning units that way. And again, I assume the critic's on my shoulder, so he sees what I'm doing. I might say, this meaning unit, there's no psychological significance. I'll go to another and I'll say, this is powerful, here's the power, and I describe it. Now, he may agree or not agree with that, but then he's got to bring in counter evidence. He can't just say, I disagree. He's got to say, I disagree because when the subject said that, I believe such and such. Okay, so it should all be out in the world. It's all open, there's nothing hidden. So I go through that, and then when I have all my transform meaning units, I've got to come up with the essential structure. That is, what is the relationship among these meaning units? Can I boil it down to its essence? I don't want to carry every detail. So what I do is then, again, through a process of imaginative variation, I come up with the structure of the experience. So the structure of the experience of learning is, and I give a full description of that, which is usually briefer than all the transform meaning units. And then that becomes my result, which I publish, and it's open for critique, for disapproval, for approval, for anything that happens. So in that sense, I'm following empirical procedures. I come up with a finding, I publish it, and it's open for criticism. So that was my way of using the Husserlian method for psychological purposes, and that comes in when I come up with the psychological meaning of a everyday expression. Husserl would come up with the most invariant philosophical meaning, and that makes all the difference. Okay, so that was my modification of Husserl's philosophical method, and I claim it's essentially phenomenological and essentially scientific because it can meet all the critical functions that a scientist has to do with the results.